commitments, including those under the Paris Agreement. The new normal that we are moving towards or attempting to move towards should be green, equitable, and sustainable. So sustainable recovery, which we're discussing in this panel, it should be socially inclusive and in line with climate action and environmental protection, because we can no longer afford to prioritize short-term economic growth at the expense of nature. Investing in a green economy makes also irrefutable economic sense. The renewable energy sector has been shown to generate 2.5 times more jobs than fossil fuels and tend to have a better gender balance. In turn, cleaner air can reduce the burden of disease from air pollution, which can cost some countries 7% of their GDP. Additionally, every dollar invested in restoring ecosystems creates up to $30 in economic benefits and enhances livelihoods. Further, with the right policies in place, a green economy can yield 24 million new jobs by 2030. So parliamentarians have a very important role to play in this transition towards sustainable recovery. Parliamentarians are key players, as you are well aware, in immediate and long-term efforts to build resilience and support recovery, particularly through the power to enact laws and oversee government policy. The laws and policies that you develop will shape not only the path of recovery, but will determine how the economy of countries look for years to come, and of course link to the resilience of societies. We know that legislation is a key driver of action, and legislative measures taken now can have implications for the planet's future. As parliamentarians entrusted by the electorate, you're in a very unique position to protect the future. You must ensure that legislative measures taken now are in line with both developmental and environmental goals and are underpinned by those core principles of LNOB. Equally important is exercising your oversight and budgeting functions in a manner that promotes a green economy. Knowing the complexity of choices and, of course, those potential solutions that are before legislators, UNEP, together with IPU, have, within the policy note that I described before, set out some key aspects of a green recovery that you can consider in your work. And I'm going to go through just 4 of these different dimensions very briefly. So the first of these dimensions is green infrastructure. Parliamentarians can prioritize laws and regulations that require public investment and incentivize private investment in green infrastructure that can contribute to creating jobs in green infrastructure and enhance related business opportunities. They can provide parliamentary oversight of government's work towards the SDGs, such as the provision of universal access to safe, inclusive, and accessible green and public spaces. Second, waste management and circularity. So parliamentarians can look at legislation which includes tax rebates or tax waivers for recycling initiatives, can mainstream sustainable consumption and production into COVID-19 recovery efforts, including green procurement requirements. You can also, of course, support sustainable consumption and production, such as extending producer responsibility and provide legislative incentives for industry. Next, looking at biodiversity and nature-based solutions. And of course, it requires these balanced risk assessments in COVID-19 recovery and planning that consider the impacts of natural capital, such as ecosystems and biodiversity. Adopting nature-based legislation that addresses the drivers of habitat loss, such as illegal wildlife trade and deforestation and unsustainable agricultural practices, as well as allocating budgets within conservation programs Sorry, my computer has just frozen on me. I apologize for that. And looking at sustainable agricultural initiatives and the urban green and blue infrastructure systems that reduce deforestation. And finally, if we look at the last dimension, which is rule of law, environmental rule of law, we need to ensure that COVID-19 legislation includes safeguards for environmental rights and that recovery efforts are not used to restrict these rights. Parliamentarians can exercise oversight in ensuring that existing environmental requirements are applied and encourage the adoption of innovative solutions and safeguards to enforce existing environmental law and standards. Finally, articulating the legislative process, the interests and concerns of constituents who may be more vulnerable. So we can see that a green recovery is not only a viable pathway to achieve the goals and targets of the 2030 Agenda, it is the only viable pathway. And we need to move towards this. And these are some suggestions for parliamentarians to consider. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Lloyd, and thank you for a very informative presentation. The two takeaways that I noticed is that, number one, the parliamentarians have a key role to play. You talked of their legislative role, their budgetary role, their oversight role. And that's extremely important because parliamentarians are sitting here. And secondly, you made a very important point that fossil fuels do not contribute to employment. It's the renewable energy sector. And you said they create 2.4% more jobs than fossil fuels. And I think that's a lot of good information for us. And that's a major incentive to have the transition from fossil fuels to renewables to clean and green energy. Thank you so much, Ms. Lloyd, and good luck for the future. Before I ask the other speaker, I'd like to mention that we have been graced by the former Prime Minister of Pakistan and leader of the opposition in the Senate, Senator Yusuf Raza Gilani Saab. Could you please stand up? And I also want to mention that among his various different, diverse background and track record, he's also been the Speaker of the National Assembly of Pakistan for over 3 years. Thank you, sir, for coming. Now, our next speaker is Ms. Sarah Wade Epichilla, Head of Partnerships and Stakeholder Engagement at the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Ms. Sarah Wade, it's over to you for 5 to 7 minutes.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction with you in this very important regional seminar. My presentation will be quite complementary to that of our colleague from UNEP, Georgina Lloyd, as we look into disaster risk reduction and how this approach can support sustainable development and recovery. The socioeconomic impact of disasters on lives and development gains is starkly clear, and of course amplified by COVID-19 and the intensification of the climate crisis. As you have experienced over the past few years, and of course most acutely and recently in Pakistan, Asia Pacific and indeed the world has been devastated by floods, droughts, extreme heat, and other hazards combined with vulnerabilities aggravated by COVID-19. They have resulted in severe health and economic impacts. And just as we are trying to turn the tide of what was an unsustainable development pattern, throughout the Asia-Pacific region, governments have had to grapple with options and trade-offs for restarting their economic engines and putting people back to work, including in key sectors that have been the most impacted by the pandemic. Nearly everything has been disrupted, while most people may simply wish to get back to normal. Instead, now is the critical time to adopt a think resilience approach, an approach to our development and climate actions to build resilience and preserve our common future. It calls for comprehensive climate and disaster risk management. It means that we must avert more biases and shortcuts that can lead to myopia and oversimplification in risk management. Parliamentarians, using your power over legislation, monitoring, accountability, and budgeting, have a fundamental role to play in building this more resilient world. The transformative nature of the 2030 Agenda and enhanced resilience requires parliamentarians to help voice citizens' concerns to ensure that no one is left behind, while also helping to shape the governance and financing systems that are desperately needed to enable it. As you know, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030 is core to achieving Sustainable Development Goals. It outlines 4 key priorities to protect development gains from the risk of disaster, including priorities to understand disaster risk, not just natural hazards, but man-made hazards and related environmental, technological, and biological hazards and their multiplier risks. It calls to strengthen disaster risk governance, including by reconfiguring governance and financial mechanisms to work across institutional silos, and of course, designing them in consultation with affected people. It calls to continuously invest in resilience, from de-risking and diversifying financing mechanisms for investment to investing in resilient infrastructure as well as nature-based solutions. And finally, it calls to enhance preparedness for effective response and to prepare for and then build back better. And I believe this became a mantra often heard since the start of the pandemic. Sendai clearly highlights the responsibility of governments to drive disaster risk reduction and prevention by integrating DRR, or disaster risk reduction, into national and local legislative and budgetary frameworks, promoting this greater understanding of risk, strengthening risk governance, and ensuring resilient investment. Indeed, Build Back Better, as one of the core elements of Priority 4, aims to utilize recovery to invest in capacity for greater resilience and preparedness for future crises. This requires establishing planning and coordination mechanisms or strengthening governance structures across ministries and working in partnership with other stakeholders. It also calls for methods and procedures to ensure that activities to build back better are adequately geared to avoid potential future risks. So again, a call to think resilience. The systemic nature of COVID crisis and climate emergency has really shown us this interconnected and multi-sectoral impact. And we can see how complex and lethal disaster risks have become. Lessons from past recovery efforts, including from disasters related to natural hazards, must be applied to ensure COVID recovery is a watershed moment to build more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable systems to avert future crises. As has been learned from past disasters, poorly coordinated recovery may lock in existing risks, thereby exacerbating it. So we cannot risk returning actually to business as usual. We must look at practices that decrease emissions, that improve the environment, and decrease disaster risk. If we don't, it's a missed opportunity. As such, every aspect of society needs to transform. Some recommendations for a risk-informed pathway include investing in that governance and institutional coordination, providing for institutional capacity building to strengthen internal processes within and across government, also from national to local, and benefiting from the private sector and civil society. 4 key elements are needed to expedite this: inspirational leadership, strong governance and mechanisms, data collection and management, and the adoption of those people-centered, leave no one behind approaches. The Bangkok Principles for Implementation of Health Aspects of the Sendai Framework can provide a framework for governments to increase and integrate the health sector, for example. In addition, cities, local authorities, and communities are often the default frontline responders. There is a greater need to strengthen resilience at the local level. Second recommendation is to be innovative in financing mechanisms. During the pandemic, most countries have rolled out economic stimulus packages that formed a substantial proportion of national GDP. However, one-time stimulus, we know, is not enough to overcome the impact and plan for future risks. A good mix of projects that generate livelihoods while developing infrastructure, for example, through climate mitigation and disaster control infrastructure, and ensuring environmental sustainability through nature-based solutions should be a key focus of the recovery stage. Third area regards resilient infrastructure investment. Pre-COVID, there was already a global infrastructure investment gap of $15 trillion US. As countries plan for recovery, we should invest in infrastructure projects that offer opportunities to address short-term job loss, long-term resilience, decarbonization objectives at the same time. The principles for resilient infrastructure developed by UNDRR to support implementation of the Sendai Framework and the Sustainable Development Goals aims to raise awareness and set an understanding of what resilient infrastructure constitutes. Finally, promoting sustainable consumption and nature-based solutions. I think we've heard from our colleague from UNEP. We know that the recovery should lead to a new normal that is more equitable and climate sensitive. Already mentioned were tax reform components of stimulus packages that can also be used to harness these opportunities.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And the next speaker would be Mr. Sabar Chaudhry from Bangladesh. He's a member of the parliament, former cabinet minister, and has been also president of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, IPU. Thank you very much. Mr. Sabar Chaudhry is online.
Yes, I am.
Okay. Very warm welcome to you, sir. Keman aছেন to bhalo? Warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you so much. And I don't have a presentation to share, but let me first extend my greetings as well as that of the Parliament of Bangladesh. And of course, we stand in full solidarity with you as you respond to the floods that have gone across Pakistan. Thoughts and prayers for those lives that have been lost. And we certainly wish you all the very best when it comes to building back better and having a more resilient Pakistan in the future.
Thank you.
What I thought I would do is just briefly talk about some of the main concepts that I think are important here. We are living in very challenging times, and the Parliament of Bangladesh adopted a resolution on a planetary emergency, not just a climate emergency, because we see that there are a number of converging crises in the horizon over a timeline of 2040 or 2050. You, of course, have the existential threat of climate change. You have the intensity and frequency of disasters. We have just seen what is happening in Pakistan. And, we are talking about a potential loss of about 30 billion is what you're looking at. So just one single natural hazard can wipe away all of your development gains that you've accumulated over the years. We have a crisis when it comes to water stress. Bangladesh is, if you look at the position of Bangladesh, we have the Himalayas on top, on the north of Bangladesh, and they are essentially the water towers for South Asia. And if with the continued rise in global temperatures, you have increased glacial melt, you're going to run short of water. So water stress also becomes a major issue. We have the unprecedented loss of biodiversity. We have a food security issue. And of course, the whole issue of planetary overshoot. How do we consume and sustain our resources for the future? So it is in that context that this event is taking place. And of course, when we talk about the Sendai framework, we go back to 2015, and there were three very important defining UN agreements. So we started off with Sendai in March and April of 2015. That was followed by the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN General Assembly. And the same year, we had the agreement on climate change, the Paris Agreement. Now, what is interesting is the Sendai framework is the only instrument that specifically identifies the role of parliamentarians when it comes to building resilience. It talks about parliamentary action in terms of legislative framework, in terms of to account, in terms of strengthening legislation, setting budget allocations. So the role of parliaments is not something that we are trying to discover for ourselves. It is actually in the agreement that our various governments have signed. And now it is for us to play that role. So I think if any parliamentarian says, how do I get into the domain of the executive? Well, the executive has actually given us that mandate because this is an agreement which has been agreed by all the governments. And of course, the other aspect is the Sustainable Development Goals that we're talking about today. And let's be very candid about this. The Sustainable Development Goals are in trouble, huge trouble. I was at an event, I think a couple of months back of UNESCAP, where they were talking about a timeline of 2065 based on current trajectory for the SDGs to be realized. So, 2030, we are not on track. And in fact, I know some people talk about COVID, but I think that's more of an excuse because even before COVID, we were actually behind track. So the SDGs are in trouble. You're looking at 2065 based on current trends, business as usual. And in some cases, as for instance, with climate change, we are actually, there is regression. There is no progress. We have actually gone back to before 2015. So that, of course, presents a very steep challenge, especially for parliamentarians, given the functions that have been already talked about. And I always believe in the 3 Ps, the power of advocacy, the power of the purse, and the power of the policy that we as parliamentarians can bring to the table. And I think it's absolutely a critical role that we have. And it is in recognition of that role that the IPU actually came up with this toolkit for the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as jointly with the UNDRR, which is actually bringing together good practices. I don't say best practice, because best is when you, for instance, in the National Assembly of Pakistan, fine-tune it and customize to your own requirements, and then it becomes a best practice. So, and this toolkit I specifically refer to because, we always talk about the capacity of the institution of parliament, as well as the capacity of individual parliamentarians. And this is a toolkit that allows us to assess ourselves. I emphasize it's a self-assessment tool. It's not an external auditor who's actually coming and checking. And this allows us to see to what extent we as an institution or as individuals are fit for the job, are fit for purpose. So I would encourage everyone to actually look at it, because I think it's something which is extremely important. And of course, in Bangladesh, one of the areas that we are trying to look at, because we have the COP27 coming up in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, I know that the IPU is organizing a parliamentary meeting, as it does during each of the COP, and I think that's on the 13th. I would certainly encourage all members from the National Assembly of Pakistan to join that if they are going to be in Egypt. So climate change, of course, is directly related to DRR. And what we have done in Bangladesh is we have tried to bring about a convergence between the agenda of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So earlier I talked about the glacial melt in the Himalayas. Let me just expand on that. So, you have more water which is actually flowing through the rivers of Bangladesh. And with that, what is happening is the rivers are overflooding, there is salinity intrusion, crops are being damaged. So the response of the Bangladesh government, or one of the responses, has been that we dredge the river. By dredging the river, we actually increase the capacity of the river to hold more water, so it doesn't spill over and go into the land and affect your crop. And then the material that we dredge, we are building embankments on either side of it, so it protects the land. And then we plant trees along there. So you see, this is DRR and climate change adaptation working together. The convergence, I think, is very important because there are limited resources we have. And if we continue to treat DRR as a separate issue from climate change adaptation, I think you're going to have duplication, you're going to have inefficiencies, and you're going to have fragmentation. So one of our job as parliamentarians is how do we ensure value for money? How do we ensure that we get the biggest bang for the dollar? And I think this is, of course, one area where we are working very hard. And I think that's something that maybe also the National Assembly of Pakistan can consider. Finally, I end with 2 points. One is the whole concept of resilience. One of the things is we use a lot of technical terms. And do really people understand it, or do we as parliamentarians understand it? And what I mean by resilience is not just our ability and capacity to respond to a crisis, but it also our ability to actually bounce back and attain a higher level of preparedness. I think that's really what is very, very important in resilience. And whenever we talk about DRR, we never refer to it as a cost. We talk about disaster risk reduction as an investment. Because if you look at it in terms of what is the benefit of action, as opposed to what is the cost of inaction, the benefits are huge. One investment, $1 investment in DRR will save you anything from $7 to $8 upwards. So it is a smart investment. DRR is a cross-cutting issue. So it's not just agriculture. It's your food security. It is your local infrastructure. It is your health. It is your education. So this is as mainstream as it gets. And looking forward, I always say that we have to reimagine development. I think that is absolutely fundamental. Business as usual is not going to work. So we have to reimagine development. We have to look at our plans, what we build, where we build, how it is being built, to what extent are we consulting with the local people, how are we adding community knowledge. These are all very important things. And the 2 other R's, so one is reimagine development is the first R. The second R, which of course applies particularly and sadly to Pakistan at this stage, is rebuild better. So reimagine development, rebuild better. The building back better, or the building back forward, that concept. And the third R is going to be recover resiliently. So it's resilient recovery. So I think if those are some of the themes that we can work on, I'm sure as parliamentarians, we can in fact create the sort of conditions and environment that will enable not just the youth of today, but also the child who is going to be born tomorrow to have the future that they really want. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Sabar Chaudhry. Sahib, presentation, because we want to learn from the example of our neighbors, particularly Bangladesh, on this issue. And the couple of points that you mentioned, I'd just like to reaffirm. You mentioned the frequency of disaster incidents. In the last 20 years, we have had about 173 freak weather incidents. And you also expressed your solidarity, your support, your succor for Pakistan and its people, for which we thank you. And you also mentioned the costs of this crisis. As of today, the estimates are in the vicinity of about $30 billion loss to Pakistan, its economy, and lives and livelihoods of the people of Pakistan. Thank you. And now we go on to the last speaker for the session before we'll open it up for general debate. And I already have some names who want to speak. This is Ms. Shazia Rafi, who is the president of Air Quality Asia. And Shazia, you are speaking, I see you, in New York. It seems you are an old Islamabad person. You're quite close to home. Thank you.
Yes. I'm speaking actually, we call it a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking from Mannahatta, the land of the Lenape, which we now call New York. So, Honorable Speaker, Honorable Ministers, Honorable President of the IPU, Honorable Members of Parliament, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Salaam Alaikum. We have all been witnessing an unprecedented time these past 2.5 years with the COVID-19 pandemic and the exacerbations of climate change. Over 6.5 million lives have been lost to COVID-19. Parallel to the pandemic and climate change is a silent killer that continues to claim almost 9 million lives annually around the world. The 7 million figure, I'm afraid, comes from 2014 based data. And this killer is air pollution. Hazardous air pollution, according to the Lancet, also increases COVID mortality by over 15%. Air pollution is also linked to climate change. The same carbon emissions that speed up global warming make air quality worse. Pakistan is facing the pincer of both crises together. Hazardous level air pollution and severe climate impacts of biblical level floods following intense heat waves. Since climate change is hard to measure, air quality monitoring, air pollution monitoring allows policymakers like you a measurement of progress or failure in real time. If one wants to mitigate, reduce climate change, you need to work on reducing air pollution. The challenge for South Asian governments is enormous, as the Indo-Gangetic Plain is ground zero of air pollution at hazardous levels. The topography of the region, with two major river basins flowing south and southeast of the Himalayan ranges, ensures that whatever carbon emissions are generated in the entire region stay there. Of the world's cities with the highest air pollution, 40 out of 42 are in South Asia, 4 are in Pakistan, 2 are in Bangladesh. As air pollution has no boundaries, we also impacted by transboundary pollution from the region's largest economy, which is neighbor to both our countries, India. My chance to really do something about this came after I retired from my post as Secretary General of Parliamentarians for Global Action for 2 decades, where I had worked with many of your parliaments on UN agreements and treaties related to sustainable development and human rights. In 2013, I formed the Parliamentary Working Group on Clean Air, just as the UN was starting negotiations on the SDGs 2030. Strong advocacy coalitions for water, soil, and biodiversity existed, but none for clean air. The right to clean air was proposed by us at the Interparliamentary Union meeting at the UN, November 2013, by then Chairman Senate of Pakistan, Honorable Nayyar Bukhari. It was based on an analysis provided by Honorable Justice Mansoor Ali Shah that this right was protected in the right to life in our constitution and, of course, in many other constitutions. This suggestion by